On a stormy night in the mountains of North Carolina, the rain seemed to swallow every sound, but not for Ranger. The old German Shepherd, once a decorated K9, stopped suddenly on the roadside, his ears pricked, his entire body rigid. To his partner, Officer Jonah Keller, it looked like nothing more than the storm playing tricks. But then Jonah heard it too. Faint, raw, almost carried away by the wind. Not a scream, not a cry, just a broken whisper, "Please, not tonight." That moment changed everything. Ranger pulled toward the forest, his paws pounding against the mud, leading Jonah to an old, half-collapsed cabin. Inside those walls was a secret Evergrove had ignored for years. A child's hand brushed against the window pane. A voice too weak to shout still begged for help. What Jonah recorded that night would haunt him, test his faith in the system, and force him to choose between the law he had sworn to uphold and the child who might not survive until morning. This is the story of a whisper that traveled miles, and the dog who refused to let it be silenced. The storm had rolled in fast, swallowing the ridgelines of Vermont's northern mountains in sheets of silver gray. Rain hammered the patrol car's roof with a steady insistence, the wipers dragging back and forth in a losing battle. Headlights carved narrow tunnels through the downpour, catching the glisten of pine trunks and the flash of water pooling on the broken asphalt. Jonah Keller leaned forward over the wheel, his tired eyes straining against the night. At 39, the job had worn him thin, in ways he didn't often admit. He had lines around his eyes carved not just from age, but from too many nights chasing shadows that sometimes weren't there. He carried the silence of loss in his bones, his wife gone too young, his house too quiet when he returned from shift. Nights like this, with only the rain and the hum of the engine, made that silence louder. Beside him, Ranger shifted. The old shepherd's body was still strong, but the years showed in the gray dusting his muzzle and the stiffness in his scarred hind leg. He no longer belonged to the roster of active-duty K9s, but Jonah never left him behind. Retirement had not dulled the dog's eyes. Those amber orbs still cut through darkness, still watched every flicker of movement with an intensity Jonah sometimes envied. The road twisted sharply around the shoulder of the mountain, trees leaning in as if the forest itself was listening. Jonah tightened his grip on the wheel. "Storm came in quick," he muttered, though the words were more for himself than for Ranger. The shepherd flicked an ear, but gave no reply. Then, without warning, Ranger stiffened. His body snapped upright, ears pricked, nose pressed against the glass. A low vibration hummed in his throat. Jonah glanced sideways. He knew that posture, alert, focused, not casual. "What is it, boy?" The rain drowned out everything, filling the car with a roar. Jonah slowed, rolling down his window a crack despite the water splattering inside. All he heard was the storm's restless voice, the groan of trees bending under the wind. For a moment he considered chalking it up to Ranger's aging nerves. But the dog wasn't trembling. He was locked in, gaze pinned toward the line of pines that swallowed the road's shoulder. Jonah pulled over, the patrol car's tires crunching gravel. He killed the engine. Silence surged in, the kind of silence that wasn't absence, but presence. A hush that carried weight. Ranger whined softly, pawing at the door. Jonah stepped out into the rain. The cold bit immediately, soaking through his jacket in seconds. Water streamed down his face, blurring his vision. He clicked on his flashlight and swept it across the trees. Raindrops turned the beam into shards of white, catching only slick bark and dripping leaves. "Nothing there," Jonah muttered. But even as he said it, unease tightened in his chest. He knew Ranger. The shepherd did not spook at shadows. And then, through the hiss of rain, he heard it. At first he thought it was a trick, some strange bend in the storm's voice, a fragment of wind caught in the trees. But no, It came again, faint, raw. Not a scream, not the sharp call of someone wanting to be found. It was a whisper, trembling and fragile. "Please, not tonight." Jonah froze, every nerve taut. The sound was swallowed almost instantly by the storm, as if the rain wanted to erase it. His light darted through the trees again, frantic now. Nothing but shadows. But Ranger barked once, short, low, certain. Jonah's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. In his years on the force, he had heard desperate voices, sometimes in alleys, sometimes over radios filled with static. But there was something about this one that clung to him, as if the voice carried not just fear, but resignation. A child's whisper, worn down by too many nights. "God help us," Jonah murmured. He opened the passenger door and let Ranger down onto the wet gravel. The shepherd landed light despite his stiff leg, nose pressed to the wind, pulling toward the forest line. Jonah followed, mud sucking at his boots. The storm clawed at them, wind dragging branches across their path. They didn't go far, not yet. Jonah stopped at the tree line, beam cutting deeper, revealing only the blur of rain-soaked underbrush. Ranger stood rigid, body straining toward the darkness. Jonah shook his head, his pulse hammering. "We can't just run blind, boy. Not yet." He knew how it worked. Without probable cause, without backup, his word alone meant little. But still, he lingered there, letting the rain soak him, listening hard, willing the whisper to come again. It didn't. Only the storm remained. Reluctantly, Jonah tugged on Ranger's leash. "We'll circle back," he whispered. His voice cracked. He hated himself for saying it, but the law had shackles as much as it had shields. Ranger resisted for a moment, then fell in step beside him, though his head never turned from the trees. Jonah opened the door, ushered the shepherd inside, and slid behind the wheel again. The engine rumbled back to life, headlights slicing through the rain. As the car rolled down the mountain road, Jonah gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. He had the unsettling sense that he had just brushed against something terrible, like placing a hand on a locked door and feeling the heat of fire on the other side. Ranger whined once, softly, then curled into the seat, ears still pointed toward the window. Jonah reached out briefly, his hand resting on the dog's wet fur. "I heard it too," he murmured. The patrol car disappeared into the storm, but the whisper lingered in Jonah's chest long after the road straightened. And somewhere behind the veil of rain, a child waited. The rain didn't ease as Jonah left the patrol car behind. It clung to him like a living thing, soaking through the seams of his jacket, running down the back of his neck. Ranger pressed ahead, straining against the leash, his weight steady, determined. His ears were pinned forward, his nose cutting through the storm, as if he were tracking something invisible that only he could read. The forest swallowed them quickly. Trees arched overhead like solemn guardians, their branches thrashing in the wind. The beam of Jonah's flashlight sliced through sheets of rain, illuminating trunks slick with water, moss glistening like emerald fire. The deeper they went, the less the sound of the road existed, until there was nothing but the roar of the storm and the rhythm of Jonah's breathing. And then, through the darkness, a shape emerged. At first, it looked like another shadow, a trick of rain and lightning. But as Jonah drew closer, he saw it clearly. An old cabin, sagging under decades of neglect. The roof had partially caved in, and one corner leaned into the mud like a man too tired to stand. Shingles dangled loose, slapping against wood with each gust of wind. A single window clung stubbornly to the front wall, its glass clouded with grime and streaked with rain. Jonah stopped several yards away, the sight pressing into him with an unsettling weight. Ranger froze too, body coiled, hackles raised. The shepherd didn't bark. He only stared, breath fast, tail stiff. Jonah's light traced the rotting boards, the warped frame, the weeds that had grown wild around the porch. He muttered under his breath, "God, someone's living in this." As if in answer, lightning split the sky. For the briefest second, the world lit up. Jonah's stomach dropped. There, behind the fogged glass of the cabin's window, a flicker of movement. It was small, fragile. A hand, a child's hand pressed flat against the pane. Jonah's breath caught. He held the light steady, but the figure had already slipped back into shadow. For a moment he thought he'd imagined it, but Ranger lunged forward, tugging hard, a growl rising low in his chest. "No, wait!" Jonah hissed, dropping to one knee to steady him. His own heart pounded against his ribs. He lifted his phone, wiped rain from the screen, and snapped a photo of the cabin, zooming toward the faint outline behind the glass. The camera blurred under the storm, but it caught enough, the small, pale imprint of a hand. Another sound carried through the storm. Faint, fragile. A cry. Not a scream. It lacked the volume. It was the kind of sound that barely fought its way out, as though the person making it had long since learned screaming brought nothing. Jonah raised the recorder he carried for interviews and clicked it on. Static mingled with the rain, but the microphone picked up enough. The crash of glass inside, the muffled sob of a child, and the heavy thud of something thrown against wood. His grip tightened around the recorder until his knuckles turned white. Every part of him screamed to break the door down, to storm inside and drag the child out. He looked at Ranger, who was trembling with tension, eyes locked on the window. The dog didn't whimper. He simply stood ready, waiting for the command. But Jonah didn't give it. "Not yet," he whispered, though the words tasted like betrayal. He had been on the force long enough to know how this worked. To cross that threshold without backup, without a warrant, would risk everything. The case could collapse in court. The man inside could walk free. And if there was more, if the rumors of other children missing were true, Jonah needed more than instinct. He needed evidence that could not be thrown away. The storm pressed harder, wind howling around the cabin, as if the forest itself knew what it contained. Jonah took another step back, heart breaking with each inch. Lightning flashed again. This time he caught another glimpse. The faint outline of a small face at the window. Hollow eyes. Tangled hair. The child didn't wave, didn't move, only stared. Jonah lowered his light. He couldn't bear to blind her with it. His throat burned as he whispered, "I see you. I promise. I'll come back." Ranger gave a low, frustrated growl, muscles taut against the leash. Jonah knelt, resting a hand on the dog's wet fur. "Not yet, boy. Not yet." He took a final photo, another recording. Then, with every ounce of willpower, he turned away. The walk back to the car felt endless. Each step was heavy, as if the mud itself wanted to keep him from leaving. Rain lashed his face, but it couldn't mask the heat behind his eyes. He had seen plenty of pain in his years, but there was something different about this. The silence of a child who had long since stopped believing anyone would come. When they reached the patrol car, Jonah opened the door with hands that trembled. Ranger leapt inside reluctantly, head whipping back toward the trees as though unwilling to leave what he had found. Jonah slid in behind the wheel, tossed the recorder on the passenger seat, and stared through the rain-blurred windshield. He pressed his palms to the steering wheel and lowered his head. If he walked away, If he treated this like any other noise complaint, Clara Doyle, or whoever that child was, wouldn't last much longer. Jonah turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. He whispered into the storm, as if the child could hear him still. "You're not alone anymore." And though the cabins sank back into darkness behind them, the promise stayed, heavy, unbreakable. The drive home was quiet, except for the storm pressing against the patrol car. Jonah kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was far away, tangled in the images he couldn't erase. The pale outline of a hand pressed against rain-streaked glass, the hollow face that had stared back at him. Each time lightning flashed across the mountains, he saw that child's eyes again, wide and silent, carrying the weight of years no 8-year-old should have known. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, ears still pricked toward the window, body taut though the road stretched empty before them. He hadn't settled once. Every few minutes a low rumble left his throat, more a vibration than a sound, as if the dog was reminding Jonah that leaving had been wrong. By the time they pulled into the narrow drive behind Jonah's small house, the storm had eased. The rain came lighter now, more of a mist than a downpour, drifting across the streetlights in silver veils. Jonah killed the engine but didn't move. His hands gripped the wheel until his knuckles whitened. He whispered, almost to himself, "God help me if I'm too late." Ranger pressed his nose against Jonah's shoulder, breaking the silence. Jonah exhaled, reached out, and ran a hand along the dog's damp fur. That quiet nudge reminded him he wasn't alone, not entirely. Inside the house, the air smelled faintly of coffee grounds and pine cleaner, the kind of scent that clung to an empty space lived in by one man and one dog. Jonah flicked on the kitchen light, the bulb humming before it glowed. He set the recorder and his phone on the table, then hung his jacket across the chair. Water still dripped from the hem, darkening the wood floor. Ranger paced the length of the kitchen, nails clicking against the tiles, pausing at the window every few steps. His body stayed rigid, ears rotating towards sounds only he could hear. Jonah watched him a moment, then turned to the evidence he'd brought back. The photos on his phone blurred with rain, but one was clear enough, a faint, small handprint against glass, the kind of detail a jury might glance at and dismiss. But Jonah knew better. He had seen too many hands like that, clutching, reaching, silent pleas that no one answered. He pressed play on the recorder. Static filled the room, layered with the hiss of rain. Then came it, the sound he'd caught outside the cabin. Martin Doyle's slurred shouting, words broken, ugly, and beneath it, a softer noise that clawed into Jonah's chest. A child's muffled cry, not loud, not defiant, just broken. Jonah slammed the pause button, jaw tightening. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window over the sink. Hollow-eyed, rain-matted hair, a man too tired of seeing too much. And in that reflection, for the briefest instant, he thought he saw her. His wife, Anna. Her face had haunted these nights before, especially when he came home from calls like this. She had been the light in his life, the one who laughed even when the world pressed heavy, the one who told him that his job mattered when he doubted it. And then, in one blink of headlights and the screech of tires, she was gone. A hit and run that no one solved, a ghost that never left. He closed his eyes, fighting the sting behind them. Anna had believed in second chances. She had once told him, "Sometimes, Jonah, you won't hear the scream. You'll only hear the whisper. And that's when you have to listen hardest." A whisper. The words struck him like a blow. That's what he had heard tonight. Not a scream, but a plea, drowned by rain. And he had walked away. His chest tightened as another memory surfaced. A case years back, a noise complaint in a rundown trailer on the edge of town. Neighbors said they thought they heard a child crying. Jonah went, knocked, heard nothing but a television blaring. He let it go. A week later, that child ended up in the hospital, beaten half to death. Jonah carried the guilt like a scar no one saw. And now, was he about to repeat that same mistake? His fist slammed the table, rattling the recorder. Ranger froze mid-pace, ears swiveling back to Jonah. The shepherd approached, nudging his head against Jonah's arm, as if grounding him in the present. Jonah let his hand rest on the dog's head, feeling the warmth beneath damp fur, the steady pulse of life and loyalty. "You always know," Jonah whispered. "You always hear what I don't." Ranger's amber eyes locked on his, steady, unwavering. The silence between them was deeper than words. The dog didn't need to speak. His pacing, his restlessness, he was telling Jonah the same thing his wife once had. Listen to the whispers. Jonah leaned back in the chair, running both hands over his face. He thought of Clara, though he didn't yet know her name, the fragile outline of a child behind glass. He thought of Martin Doyle, a man who once had been respected in town, now rotting in anger and alcohol. And he thought of himself, sitting in a kitchen at midnight, with proof in his hands and the gnawing doubt of whether he'd acted too late. He reached for the recorder again, pressed play, and let it run this time. Martin's voice filled the room, angry, senseless. Then, that faint sob. Jonah's throat tightened. He clicked stop, then saved the file, labeling it with the date and time. He pulled out a notepad, jotting notes with quick strokes. Cabin location, North Ridge. Evidence, child's hand at window. Audio, Doyle's voice, plus faint child cries. Risk, child in immediate danger. His pen paused. He stared at the last line. He underlined it twice. Jonah pushed away from the table, walking toward the window. Outside, the storm had thinned, leaving the night heavy and still. The forest loomed in the distance, black against gray skies. Somewhere out there, a child was curled in fear, waiting for someone to hear her whisper. "I'm not leaving you there," he murmured to the glass. His reflection stared back, a man weary but resolute. Behind him, Ranger circled once, and finally lay down near the door. But even then, the shepherd didn't close his eyes. His ears stayed upright, listening. Always listening. Jonah let his hand rest on the cold glass of the window, a silent vow forming in his chest. He had ignored the whispers once before, and it had cost more than he could bear. This time, he would not. No matter the law, no matter the cost, he would not walk away again. The cabin shuddered with each gust of wind, its walls groaning like an old ship at sea. Rain hammered the tin roof, rattling loose shingles, leaking through cracks where wood had long since rotted. The air inside smelled of stale whiskey, damp clothes, and something sour. Unwashed dishes piled high in the sink, mold creeping along the edges of the floorboards. In the far corner, half hidden in shadow, Clara Doyle sat curled into herself, her knees hugged to her chest, thin arms wrapped tight as though her bones might splinter without the pressure. She was 8 years old, but her body looked younger. Too small, too light, bruises blooming across her skin like faded stains no one bothered to clean. Her eyes, wide and grey as storm clouds, stared blankly at the floor. She didn't cry. She hadn't for months. Tears had once been her language, her desperate plea for her mother to return, for her stepfather to soften, for someone, anyone, to notice. But tears never changed anything. They only made the shouting louder, the fists harder, the nights longer. So Clara learned silence. She wore it now like armor, heavy but reliable. Across the room, Martin Doyle staggered near the kitchen counter, bottle clutched in one meaty hand. His frame was still broad, shoulders once carrying the proud strength of a hunter, but now slouched under the weight of years and alcohol. His hair was tangled, streaked with grey, his beard patchy and unkempt. The whiskey on his breath filled the cabin like gasoline fumes. "Worthless," he slurred, slamming the bottle down so hard it rattled the chipped plates beside it. "Always looking at me with those eyes, like your mother." The bottle tipped, amber liquid spilling across the counter, dripping to the floor. He didn't notice, or didn't care. He turned on Clara, his voice jagged, sharp. "You think I don't see it? That pity, that judgment. You're nothing but a shadow of her. She left me with you, left me to carry it all." Clara flinched at the sound, but didn't move otherwise. She knew better. Any sudden motion could draw him closer, could spark another blow. She had learned survival in rhythms, counting the seconds between footsteps, memorizing the patterns of his rage. In her small hand, hidden within the folds of her oversized sweater, she clutched a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but she knew every line of it by heart. Her mother, holding her as a baby, smiling with a softness Clara barely remembered. It was the only photo Martin hadn't destroyed. Why he kept it, Clara didn't know. Maybe guilt, maybe anger, maybe he just liked the way it hurt. Her mother's face was her anchor, the only proof that gentleness had once lived in this house. At night, when the shouting quieted and the whiskey finally dragged Martin into sleep, Clara would stare at the photo until her eyes burned, whispering to it as though the paper could hear. "Please come back. Please take me with you." But the photo never answered. Martin grabbed a plate and hurled it against the wall. The crash echoed like thunder. Shards scattered across the floor, one skittering near Clara's bare foot. She didn't flinch. Not anymore. "You ruin everything," he roared, stumbling toward his recliner. His boots dragged across the warped boards, leaving mud streaks from earlier hunts, or nights in town that he never explained. He collapsed into the chair, the bottle still in hand, muttering curses to no one in particular. His head sagged against the worn cushion, eyes bloodshot, staring at nothing. The cabin fell into its familiar pattern. Storm outside, silence inside, and Clara's heartbeat a steady drum against her ribs. She thought of nights before this one, of winters where the fire went cold because Martin refused to chop wood, of summers when she hid in the thicket behind the cabin while he raged. She thought of school days cut short, neighbors who never asked questions, and the way the world seemed built to keep her invisible. Invisible, except to him. Her mind flickered back further, to before everything broke, to when her mother still lived. Clara remembered the way her mother sang while washing dishes, the way she braided Clara's hair with careful fingers. She remembered the warmth of arms that held her through storms, whispers of comfort against her ear. Those memories lived like faint embers, dim but stubborn. And then the sickness came. Pneumonia, they said. A cough that grew worse, a fever that never broke. Clara was too young to understand, but she remembered the night the coughing stopped. The house grew silent in a way it had never been before. Martin's grief turned sharp, heavy, aimed squarely at the small girl who shared her mother's eyes. From that night, Clara became a target, not of love, but of blame. Thunder shook the cabin, rattling the lone window. Clara's gaze drifted toward it. Rain streaked the glass, warping the world outside into blurred shadows. She longed for the sound of something beyond this place, for voices that weren't slurred, for footsteps that weren't threats. But hope was dangerous. Hope had teeth. So she clung to silence. Martin mumbled something in his chair, words slurring into nonsense. The bottle slipped from his hand, thunked against the floor, and rolled beneath the table. His head lolled forward, a string of snores breaking the storm's rhythm. Clara exhaled, barely audible. Relief didn't come. Only the routine, night after night, fear after fear. She rested her forehead on her knees, closing her eyes. But somewhere, beyond the storm, beyond the glass, she wondered if her whisper had traveled farther than she believed. And in that thought, faint but alive, a flicker of warmth sparked against the cold. The storm outside rolled on like a living beast, rattling the cabin walls. But inside, another storm brewed. A smaller space, tighter, deadlier. The whiskey bottle was nearly empty, its neck slick with sweat from Martin Doyle's hands. He sat slouched in his chair, lips moving around curses that slurred together, sharp only in the venom behind them. His eyes, once sharp with the patience of a hunter, now sagged red and watery. But when they landed on Clara, crouched in the corner, they hardened into something colder. "Look at you," he spat, voice thick. "Sitting there like a ghost. You think you're better than me? Just like her." Clara didn't answer. She had learned long ago that her silence wasn't defiance. It was her shield. But to Martin, silence was an accusation, a mirror he could not bear. "Don't you look at me like that." His voice cracked, bouncing off the cabin walls. He pushed himself to his feet, stumbling as the room tilted beneath him. The bottle clattered onto the floorboards, spilling the last of its contents, the sharp scent of whiskey filling the air. He staggered toward her. Clara shrank tighter into her corner, but she knew it was useless. Once his fury fixed on her, there was nowhere safe. "You're her shadow, her curse," he growled, looming over her. "Every time I see your face, I see hers, smiling like she didn't leave me here to rot." His hand shot out, fingers curling into the collar of her oversized sweater. He yanked her up with one motion, her small body weightless to him. Clara gasped, the sudden lift tearing a sound from her throat she didn't mean to make. That sound enraged him further. "You dare cry?" His spit sprayed as he shook her, her head snapping side to side. "I'll give you something to cry about." The back of her head hit the wall with a dull thud. The breath rushed out of her lungs. She didn't scream. Screaming only fueled him. Instead, she let her body go limp, her eyes drifting to the photo, still hidden in her sleeve. Her mother's face, smudged but smiling, stared back at her, even now. Martin pinned her there, one hand pressed against her chest, the other braced on the wall. His face hovered inches from hers, his breath hot and rancid. "You killed her," he hissed. "The moment you came into this world, she started dying, and you think I don't know it?" His words tore at her like claws. Clara's chest heaved, but no sound came. She had heard these accusations 100 times before, but each repetition dug deeper. He wanted her to believe it, that she was the reason love had left this house, the reason death had taken her mother. For a heartbeat, his grip tightened, and Clara thought this might be the end. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room swimming. But then his strength faltered. His body swayed, drunk and heavy. With a final shove, he slammed her against the wall, releasing her so suddenly that she slid down to the floor. Her head struck the boards with a hollow crack, and stars flared behind her eyes. Martin stumbled back, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his temple. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, muttering curses as though she weren't even there anymore. Always watching me, always judging. You'll learn, girl. You'll learn. He staggered back to his recliner, dropped into it with the graceless weight of a falling tree. He grabbed for the bottle, found only air, and cursed louder. Then he leaned back, head lolling to the side. Within moments, snores rumbled from his chest, broken and uneven, like an engine sputtering out. Clara lay still, where she had fallen, her breath shallow, her body trembling in small, controlled spasms. Her back ached where it had hit the wall, her skull throbbed where it had met the floor. But she stayed silent, always silent. Her small fingers searched inside her sleeve until they brushed the edge of the photograph. She pulled it out, pressing it to her chest as though it could steady her heartbeat. In the dim light, the photo glowed faintly, her mother's smile etched into paper that smelled of dust and old ink. Clara whispered so quietly that even she barely heard herself. "I didn't kill you. I didn't." Her eyes slid to Martin, sprawled in the chair, mouth open, snoring through whiskey fumes. He looked monstrous and pitiful all at once, like a beast too broken to know it was dying. The storm outside rattled the cabin again, wind whistling through the cracks, carrying away the sound of her whisper. But her words stayed inside her, alive, defiant. Clara closed her eyes, clutching the photo until her knuckles whitened. If she could make herself small enough, quiet enough, invisible enough, maybe the night would pass, maybe tomorrow would come. And somewhere far beyond the storm, a shepherd with scarred fur lifted his head from restless sleep, ears twitching toward a sound only he seemed able to hear. The cabin had gone quiet, except for the rasp of Martin's drunken snores. They rose and fell like the guttural growl of some animal trapped in its den. His recliner creaked each time his bulk shifted, the empty bottle still clutched weakly in his hand. Clara stayed still for a long time, afraid to breathe too loudly. Her back ached where he'd shoved her, and the side of her head pulsed with a dull, throbbing pain. The storm outside pressed its weight against the walls, thunder low and rolling, rain streaking the single window like fingers trying to claw their way inside. When she was sure he wouldn't wake, not yet, Clara began to move. Slowly, carefully, she unfolded from the corner where he had left her. Her body was small, but each movement felt enormous, echoing in her mind, as though the boards themselves might betray her. She placed her bare feet softly on the wood, crawling on hands and knees, until she reached the side wall. Her fingers brushed against cold glass. The cabin's lone window was streaked with condensation, warped by years of neglect. As she wiped a small circle clear with her sleeve, though the fabric was too damp to do much. Beyond the fogged pane, the night was a blur of shadows, pines swaying under the storm's fury, lightning splitting the sky in jagged veins of light. Clara pressed her forehead against the cool glass. The world outside looked impossibly far away. People lived out there. Neighbors, strangers, townsfolk she sometimes saw from the back seat of Martin's truck, but none of them ever came here. No one ever asked why she never appeared at school anymore. No one knocked on the cabin door. It was as if the woods themselves conspired to keep her hidden. Her lips trembled. For so long she had held her silence, But silence had become its own prison, and tonight her chest ached with the need to break it, if only for a moment. She closed her eyes, gripped the faded photo of her mother in her sleeve, and let the words slip out in the faintest whisper. "Please, not tonight." The sound was fragile, like a feather caught on the wind. The storm swallowed it almost instantly. But still she spoke again, forcing air through her raw throat. "Please, someone, hear me." Her voice cracked, so soft that even she barely recognized it. But the moment the words escaped, she felt something shift inside her, as though she had opened a door she had been too afraid to touch. It wasn't a scream. It was smaller, weaker. Yet in its weakness lay something powerful, a seed of hope carried into the night. Lightning lit the forest beyond, casting everything in silver for a heartbeat. Clara's breath fogged the glass, and in it she saw her reflection. Wild hair, hollow eyes, bruises blooming beneath her skin. For a moment, she imagined her mother standing behind her reflection, whispering back, "I hear you, Clara. I hear you." Her throat tightened. Tears welled, but they didn't fall. They never did anymore. She stayed there, whispering words too soft to matter, too faint to travel far. Yet somehow, in the vastness of the storm, they carried. Miles away, in a small house on the edge of town, a German shepherd stirred from restless half-sleep. Ranger lifted his head, ears flicking sharply, nose twitching as though a scent had drifted through the closed windows, his amber eyes fixed on the dark woods beyond the glass. A sound, not the storm, not the wind, had reached him. He rose, stiff but certain, and paced to the door, pressing his muzzle against the wood. A low whine rumbled in his throat, a plea of his own. Jonah Keller, slouched at his kitchen table with files spread before him, glanced up. He saw the dog's posture, alert, listening. He heard the faint whine that sounded like desperation. "What is it, boy?" Jonah murmured. But when Ranger turned to him, eyes burning with urgency, Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. Back in the cabin, Clara pressed both hands to the glass now, her small palms flat against the cold pane. She whispered one last time, voice nearly gone. "Please, help me." Her words vanished into the storm, drowned by thunder. But somehow, in the strange language that existed between pain and loyalty, between silence and instinct, Ranger heard her. He knew it as surely as he knew his own heartbeat. Clara slid down against the wall, exhausted, her body trembling. She tucked the photo of her mother back into her sleeve and curled up on the floor beneath the window. Her eyes fluttered shut, not from peace, but from sheer fatigue. The storm raged on. Martin snored in his chair, and somewhere, a bond neither of them could yet understand had just been forged, between a child who whispered into the night and a dog who had never stopped listening. Morning came slow to Evergrove, its light diluted by a thin veil of mist that clung to the hills like a secret the town refused to share. Puddles shimmered along the cracked asphalt roads, reflecting gray skies and telephone wires that sagged beneath the weight of rain. For most, it was just another day in a town where time seemed content to drift. But for Jonah Keller, the air carried something heavier. He hadn't slept. The images from the night before haunted him. The flicker of a small hand against glass. The muffled cry he thought he heard carried through the storm. Ranger had paced the floor until dawn, restless, ears pricked, as though waiting for another sound. Even now, seated in the passenger seat of Jonah's old Ford, The shepherd remained rigid, his amber eyes locked on the world outside. Jonah turned the wheel, guiding the truck toward the edge of town. His plan had been simple: a stop for gas, maybe coffee, before starting his shift. But his gut told him there would be no ordinary morning today. The gas station appeared like a relic from another decade. Ed's place had stood on that corner for 40 years, a single pump leaning like an old man's spine, a flickering neon open sign in the window, and a wooden bench beneath the awning where time itself seemed to pause. Jonah slowed as he pulled in, his headlights cutting through the mist. That's when he saw her. A small figure sat hunched on the bench, swallowed by an oversized gray hoodie. Her bare legs dangled above the concrete, thin and pale, the skin marked with faint bruises. Strands of tangled brown hair hid most of her face, but Jonah didn't need to see clearly. He recognized her instantly. The girl from the cabin. The hand at the glass. Jonah's chest tightened. He shifted the truck into park, his eyes never leaving the fragile shape on the bench. For a moment, he wondered if she might be a ghost of his sleepless mind, conjured by guilt and stormlight. But then Ranger moved. The shepherd let out a soft, urgent whine, pressing his nose against the windshield. His tail twitched once, then he pawed at the dashboard, restless. Jonah exhaled, steadying himself. "All right, boy," he murmured. "Go slow." He opened the door, and Ranger leapt down first, landing with a grace that belied his age. The dog's paws splashed through shallow puddles as he trotted toward the bench, head low, body language calm. The girl didn't flinch at his approach. She sat as if carved from the mist itself, unmoving, her thin shoulders drawn inward. Ranger stopped a foot away, sniffed the air, then stepped closer. Gently, carefully, he pressed his muzzle to her hand. Jonah froze. Ranger was disciplined, trained, cautious with strangers. But this time, he acted on something deeper than training. He nudged her hand once, then lowered his head and licked it softly. The girl stirred. Slowly, her fingers curled into the thick fur around his neck. She clung to him, not out of fear, but like a drowning child finding driftwood. Her shoulders shook once, but no sound came. Jonah felt something break inside him. He stepped forward, careful not to startle her, his boots scraping lightly against the wet pavement. "Hey there," he said, his voice low and even, the way he spoke to skittish animals or grieving parents at accident scenes. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond. She only buried her face deeper into Ranger's neck, her small hands gripping tighter. The shepherd stood perfectly still, tail still, chest rising steady, as if offering her his heartbeat in place of words. Jonah crouched a few feet away, keeping his distance. Up close, the details carved themselves into his vision. The bruises circling her wrists like faded shackles, the yellowing mark beneath her eye, the raw scrapes on her knees. His throat burned. From inside the station window, Ed appeared, his wiry frame silhouetted by the dull glow of a hanging bulb. His expression was grave, eyes flicking between Jonah and the girl. He gave a small, grim nod, as though to confirm what Jonah already knew. This wasn't the first time she had been left here. Jonah swallowed hard and returned his gaze to her. "Clara, right?" The name felt heavy on his tongue. She didn't lift her head, but the faintest tremor rippled through her shoulders at the sound of it. "You're safe with us," Jonah repeated. He glanced at Ranger, still standing like a sentinel beside her. "He'll make sure of it." For the first time, the girl looked up. Her eyes, gray, wide, and hollow, met Jonah's for a fleeting second before darting away. But in that second, he saw everything. The fear, the exhaustion, and somewhere beneath it, a spark of something that hadn't died yet. She tightened her grip on Ranger, burying her face in his fur once more. Jonah didn't press. He knew trust couldn't be forced. It had to be earned, the same way Ranger had earned it in an instant by simply listening. The rain had stopped, but the world remained heavy, the air damp with secrets. Jonah rose slowly, glancing back toward the station door. Ed was already moving, disappearing toward the office where the old surveillance system hummed. Evidence waited there. Confirmation of what Jonah suspected. Perhaps proof of what Clara could not yet say. But for now, only one thing mattered. The girl trusted the dog, and Jonah understood the unspoken truth. If he wanted to reach her, he would have to do it through Ranger. He exhaled, the weight of the night before pressing down harder. Something had begun on that bench, something fragile, something dangerous. But for the first time, Jonah allowed himself to believe it might also be something that could save her. The gas station's bell gave a hollow chime as Jonah pushed the door open. The inside smelled of old motor oil and coffee left too long on the burner. Behind the counter, Ed Miller stood wiping his hands on a rag already soaked with grease. He was wiry, gray-haired, his face carved by decades of weather and work. He didn't bother with small talk. His eyes flicked once toward the bench outside where Clara still sat with Ranger, then back to Jonah. "I saw it," he said flatly, his voice low. "This morning, just after 6. Jonah stepped closer, his boots scuffing against the worn linoleum. "Tell me." Ed leaned on the counter, his jaw tight. "Red Dodge pickup. Old model, early 2000s. Belongs to Martin Doyle. He pulled in quick. Didn't even cut the engine. Door opened, and he shoved her out like she was trash. Didn't look back. Just muttered something under his breath and drove off." Jonah's fists clenched at his sides. His mind flashed with the image of Clara curled on that bench, damp hoodie clinging to her, bruises dark against pale skin. He forced his voice to stay calm. "You're sure it was Doyle?" Ed's eyes hardened. "I've known that truck since it was new, and I've known that man since before the bottle claimed him. It was Doyle. No mistake." Jonah nodded once, steady but grim. "Do your cameras still work?" Ed hesitated, then jerked his thumb toward a side office. "Old system, black and white feed, but yeah, caught the whole thing." They moved into the back room, where a humming monitor sat on a desk cluttered with receipts and empty coffee cups. Ed tapped a few buttons, the screen flickering to life. Static rolled across the feed before settling into grainy footage. "There," Ed said, pointing. Jonah leaned in. The timestamp read 6:15 a.m. The image showed the Dodge pulling into the lot, headlights cutting through the mist. The driver's door opened, and a heavy-set man climbed out, shoulders broad, posture sloppy with drink. Martin Doyle. He grabbed something from the passenger side. Then, with a motion so careless it turned Jonah's stomach, he shoved Clara out onto the pavement. She stumbled, nearly fell before steadying herself. Even on the grainy footage, Jonah saw the way she didn't cry out, didn't move toward the truck. She just stood there, small and silent, as if this was nothing new. Doyle muttered something inaudible, slammed the door, and drove off. Jonah exhaled through his nose, the air sharp. "I'll need a copy of that." Ed pulled a flash drive from a drawer, inserted it into the terminal, and with a few keystrokes, the footage was transferred. He handed it over, his fingers trembling slightly. "You do something with this, Keller. Don't let this get buried like the rest." Jonah slipped the drive into his jacket pocket. I won't. Back outside, Clara hadn't moved. She sat with her face pressed into Ranger's fur, the dog standing guard as though carved from stone. Jonah crouched beside them, lowering his voice. I'm going to take care of this, Clara. You're not alone anymore. She didn't look at him, but her fingers tightened in Ranger's coat. Jonah took that as her answer. He straightened, his mind racing. At the patrol car, he slid the flash drive into the onboard computer. The screen glowed to life, showing the file. He replayed the footage twice, memorizing every detail. License plate, timestamp, Doyle's careless shove. Then, using the department's remote access, he began cross-checking. The system was clunky, but it held years of archived surveillance feeds from gas stations, highway toll booths, and small-town traffic cams. Jonah pulled up the database, entering Doyle's plate number. Results trickled in. Each time, Doyle's truck appeared, timestamped at odd hours. 2 Hulk AM, 3 Hulk AM, always heading out of town, always returning hours later. The routes traced in red across the map told a story. Into the deep woods, toward Miller Creek Road, circling areas of forest where no business existed. Jonah felt the unease crawl into his chest. These weren't random drives. They were patterns. He scrolled further, finding other feeds. Each trip was logged but never questioned. Reports had been filed vaguely, noise complaints, sightings of headlights in the woods, but nothing had stuck. Nothing had been pursued. And now here was Clara, bruised, abandoned on a bench. The threads began to weave together. Jonah sat back, running a hand across his jaw. He thought of his late wife, how the system had failed her, how he had failed to find the man who took her life. He thought of other cases, whispers ignored because there wasn't enough evidence, because the rules had tied his hands. Not this time. He glanced at Ranger, who had climbed into the back seat beside Clara. The shepherd's head rested across her lap, his amber eyes watching the world outside, while her small hands knotted in his fur. She looked fragile, but the way she held on told Jonah she wasn't broken. Not yet. Jonah tapped a note into his phone, listing the evidence. Video footage from Ed Station. Surveillance patterns of late-night trips. Witness statement from Ed Miller. Physical condition of the child. Bruises, malnourishment. It was a building. Piece by piece, the case was forming. He looked back at Clara once more. Her gray eyes flicked up just briefly, meeting his. For the first time, he saw not just fear, but a question there. Unspoken, but clear. Will you do something this time? Jonah gave the smallest nod. A promise. The storm had passed, but inside him another storm was just beginning. The sky had begun to brighten, though the morning sun was still hidden behind a ceiling of low gray clouds. The mist clung stubbornly to the roads, curling around the tires of Jonah's patrol car like smoke. Inside the vehicle, the heater hummed softly, fighting the damp chill that seemed to have settled into Clara's bones. She sat in the back seat, still pressed close to Ranger. Her knees were pulled up to her chest, and the oversized hoodie seemed to swallow her whole. She hadn't said a word since Jonah had first approached her at the gas station. Not when he guided her gently to the car, not when Ranger climbed in beside her, laying his head in her lap. Jonah glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Her eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on her hands, which were buried in Ranger's fur, fingers tangled in the thick black and tan coat, as if afraid he might disappear. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, foil-wrapped energy bar. He unwrapped it halfway, then turned, careful to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "Here," he said softly, holding it out to her. "It's not much, but it'll help." Clara didn't move. She stared at the wrapper, her lips pressing together. For a long moment, Jonah thought she might not take it. Then, almost reluctantly, her hand left Ranger's fur. She took the bar with trembling fingers and clutched it tightly, but she didn't eat. Jonah's chest ached. "It's okay," he murmured. "You don't have to if you're not ready." He started to turn back toward the wheel when he heard it. Her voice, so faint he almost thought it was the wind sneaking in through the cracked window. "Don't call him." Jonah froze. The words were barely more than a whisper, but they carried a weight that pressed like ice against his spine. He turned again, meeting her eyes in the mirror. They were wide, gray, and desperate. "What did you say?" he asked gently. Her fingers clenched tighter around the energy bar, crumpling the wrapper. "Don't call him," she repeated, a little stronger this time. Her voice cracked, raw from disuse, but the terror inside it was unmistakable. Jonah's throat tightened. She didn't have to say his name. He knew. Martin Doyle. "I won't," Jonah said, his voice firm, steady. "I promise you, Clara, I'm not calling him." The girl blinked rapidly, as if the promise startled her. She pressed her lips together again and turned her face into Ranger's fur, as though hiding inside the dog's steady heartbeat. Jonah sat still for a moment, letting the silence stretch. He could feel his pulse hammering, the weight of her plea anchoring itself in his chest. That was her first real word to him, her first act of trust. Not food, not safety, just the desperate hope that he wouldn't hand her back to the man who hurt her. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the contacts until he reached the number he knew he had to call. He hit dial. The line clicked after 2 rings. "Grace Ramirez," a clear, steady voice answered. "Grace, it's Jonah Keller," he said. His voice dropped lower. "I need you." There was a pause. Grace was a child services worker he'd worked with before. Sharp, compassionate, unwilling to look away from hard truths. She had earned a reputation in Evergrove for being relentless, even when the system dragged its feet. "Tell me," she said simply. Jonah glanced at the rearview mirror again. Clara hadn't moved, but her small shoulders rose and fell with quick, shallow breaths. Ranger's head remained steady in her lap, his ears flicking whenever she twitched. "I've got an 8-year-old girl," Jonah said, keeping his voice calm. "Bruises on her wrists and face, malnourished. Picked up this morning at Ed's station. Witness and camera footage confirm her stepfather, Martin Doyle, abandoned her there. She begged me not to call him. Grace." He let the silence hang. "It's bad." On the other end, he heard Grace inhale sharply. "Clara Doyle?" "Yes." Another pause, heavier this time. When Grace spoke again, her tone was measured, but Jonah could hear the anger simmering beneath it. "I've had reports about that household before. Not enough evidence for removal. Every time I pushed, the case stalled. But if you've got footage and a witness—" "I do." Jonah pressed a hand against the steering wheel, steadying himself. "And I've got a child who's terrified of going back." Grace's voice softened, but only slightly. "Then we don't send her back. I'll start the emergency paperwork, but you know how slow it can be. The judge might not sign off until tonight, maybe longer." Jonah's jaw tightened. "She can't wait that long." "I know," Grace said. "Listen, keep her with you for now. I'll drive out to meet you in an hour. We'll make a plan together. She needs stability, and she's already chosen who she trusts." Jonah glanced at the mirror again. Clara's hands were still buried in Ranger's fur. The choice was obvious. "Understood," he said. "Jonah?" Grace's voice sharpened. "Don't do anything reckless. We can't afford mistakes." He exhaled slowly. "No promises." The call ended. Jonah set the phone down, his eyes lingering on the girl in the back seat. Her face was hidden, but he could see the small tremor in her shoulders, the way she clung to Ranger as though he were the only thing tethering her to this world. "You're safe with us," Jonah said quietly. He wasn't sure if she heard, but Ranger's tail thumped once against the seat, a soft, steady beat in the silence. Outside, the clouds began to break, a sliver of pale sunlight slipping through the mist. It wasn't much, but it was enough to paint the edge of Clara's hair in gold. For Jonah, it felt like the first fragile thread of hope. The forest was a different world at night. The mist that lingered in town had thinned into tatters here, drifting low across the underbrush like breath from an unseen mouth. Crickets had fallen silent. Even the owls seemed to hold their calls. The only sound was the steady crunch of Jonah's boots on damp pine needles and the soft huff of Ranger's breath at his side. They moved carefully, following the narrow ridge that overlooked Martin Doyle's property. Jonah carried a small recorder clipped inside his jacket and a pair of binoculars slung across his chest. He had done this before: stakeouts, surveillance, waiting in the shadows for the truth to reveal itself. But tonight felt different. Tonight wasn't just about a case file. Tonight was about Clara. Ranger stopped first. The shepherd froze mid-step, muscles taut, ears pricked forward. His nose lifted, drawing in the air. Jonah followed his gaze down into the hollow where the cabin crouched in darkness. Its roof sagged under years of neglect, and one corner leaned like a tired shoulder. A lantern glowed faintly in the front window, casting crooked bars of light onto the clearing. Jonah crouched low, signaling Ranger with a hand. The dog obeyed, dropping silently into the wet leaves, though his hackles stood raised along his back. Jonah crawled forward until his chest pressed against the cold earth. From here, through a gap in the branches, he had a clear view of the cabin. The first sound reached him seconds later. A man's voice, sharp, erratic, slurring between curses. Even muffled by the walls, it was unmistakable. Martin Doyle. Jonah raised the binoculars. Through the grimy glass of the window, he saw movement. A heavy-set figure pacing the room. Martin's arms flailed as he shouted, his shadow lurching across the walls like a monster with no master. At one point, he hurled a bottle against the far wall. It shattered in a spray of glass, the echo reaching Jonah's perch a moment later. Then came a smaller sound. Thin, fragile, a cry. Jonah's chest clenched. He adjusted the binoculars, his jaw tightening as he caught sight of Clara. She was huddled in the far corner of the room, her body folded into itself, hands over her ears. The blanket wrapped around her looked too thin, more rag than comfort. Even from this distance, Jonah could see her shoulders trembling. Beside him, Ranger growled. It was a low, primal rumble that vibrated through the ground. His teeth bared, breath sharp through his nose. Jonah reached out quickly, his hand gripping the dog's collar. "Easy, boy," Jonah whispered, though his own voice quivered with the same anger. "I know. I see her too." Ranger's body quaked with the instinct to charge, to shatter the silence with force. Jonah held him firm, his knuckles white against the leather strap. His own instinct screamed the same. Go now, kick the door in, end it. But he couldn't. Not yet. Jonah forced himself to breathe slowly, to remember the words Grace had spoken. We can't afford mistakes. Evidence was the only thing that would hold against Doyle's denials, against a system too ready to look the other way. He unclipped the recorder from his jacket and pressed it flat to the damp earth, angling the microphone toward the cabin. Martin's tirades carried through the still night, sharp enough to etch themselves into digital memory. Words slurred with rage, accusations spat at shadows. Useless brat, always looking at me like her, like I'm the villain. Jonah closed his eyes briefly, each phrase cutting deeper. When he opened them, he saw Clara flinch, saw her press tighter into the wall as Martin staggered closer. Ranger strained again, a growl rattling his chest. Jonah leaned into the dog, pressing his forehead against the shepherd's ear. "Not yet," he whispered fiercely. "I need them to hear this. I need them to see it. It's the only way." The dog whined low, torn between obedience and instinct. His eyes, lit faintly by moonlight, stayed locked on the cabin below. Jonah adjusted his binoculars again, his hand trembling. Every fiber of his being rebelled at the waiting. He thought of his wife, how he had once sworn to protect, and had failed. He thought of all the times he had chosen patience and procedure over action, and how those choices left scars that never healed. This time he would not fail. Down at the cabin, Martin collapsed into his chair, clutching another bottle. His mutters softened, drifting into incoherence. Clara didn't move, didn't dare. She seemed carved from the shadows themselves, a silent witness to her own suffering. Jonah snapped a few photographs through the binoculars, the faint click of his camera app loud in the quiet woods. Each shot captured Martin's posture, the shattered glass on the floor, Clara's bruised form cowering in the corner. Proof. Hard evidence. He pressed the recorder closer to the ground, ensuring every curse, every threat, every sob etched itself into the timeline he would later hand to Grace. Minutes stretched long. The forest felt frozen, holding its breath with him. Then, finally, Martin's head lolled to the side, his snores rattling the window panes. Jonah exhaled, the sound shaking in his chest. He reached over and stroked Ranger's neck, feeling the tremors of restrained fury still pulsing through the dog. "You did good," Jonah whispered. "We'll get her. But not like this. Not tonight." Ranger's ears twitched, his gaze still fixed on the dim light below. Jonah pocketed the recorder and slid the binoculars back into their case. He lingered a moment longer, committing the sight to memory. The broken cabin, the monster inside, and the child who deserved far more than silence. Then he pulled back, tugging gently on Ranger's collar. They melted into the woods, footsteps careful, retreating into the shadows of the ridge. The storm inside Jonah's chest didn't ease. It grew sharper, clearer, like a blade being honed. This wasn't over. It had only begun. The sheriff's office was quiet after hours, the hum of fluorescent lights, the only sound echoing through the empty halls. Most of the deputies had gone home, their reports filed, their radios silent. Jonah Keller sat alone at his desk, the glow of his monitor illuminating the hard lines of his face. Ranger lay sprawled on the floor beside him, chin resting on his paws, amber eyes half closed, but not asleep. Jonah leaned forward, fingers tapping across the keyboard. The USB drive from Ed's station clicked into the side port, the folder opening with the grainy footage of Martin Doyle shoving Clara from the red Dodge. Jonah had already watched it more times than he could stomach. Each viewing only hardened the knot in his chest, but now he needed more. He opened the county's surveillance archive system, a patchwork network of traffic cams, convenience store feeds, and the occasional gas station that still uploaded to the database. It was an imperfect web, full of gaps and blind spots, but it sometimes caught the patterns people thought were invisible. Jonah entered Doyle's license plate number. The system churned, pulling in results. A list began to populate, each entry stamped with dates, times, and locations. Jonah scrolled through, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. The trips were irregular during the day. Supply runs, liquor store visits, nothing unusual. But at night, something shifted. Between 2 o'clock and 3:30 a.m., the same plate appeared. Camera flashes caught it heading out of town, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sometimes it was logged at the old bridge near Miller Creek Road, Other times near the Forestry Service gates, areas no one had any business being in at that hour. Jonah traced the data onto a map, red dots spreading like blood drops across the forested terrain. Every route veered deeper into the woods, miles from paved roads, closer to abandoned logging trails few remembered. "What were you doing out there, Doyle?" Jonah muttered under his breath. Ranger stirred at the sound of his voice, lifting his head. His ears pricked, catching the low edge of tension Jonah couldn't hide. Jonah scrolled further, following the trail across months. The pattern was unmistakable. Dozens of trips, always late, always secret, always toward the same direction. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the glowing screen. This was bigger than child abuse. Something darker festered in those woods. Jonah's mind wandered back to the whispers he'd heard at the diner. Locals muttering about headlights seen weaving between the trees at odd hours, about the distant sound of engines when the world should have been asleep. He remembered the reports that crossed his desk, vague complaints dismissed as hunters or teenagers. He had ignored them, just like everyone else. But now, Clara's face, gray eyes wide with silent terror, tied it all together. Jonah clicked through several feeds, stopping when he found one grainy frame that made his stomach turn. Doyle's truck was parked at the edge of a forestry road, time-stamped at 2:47 a.m. A second set of headlights appeared behind him for a brief moment, then vanished into the trees. Jonah froze the frame, leaning closer. The second vehicle wasn't clear, but its presence was enough. Doyle wasn't alone. Ranger growled softly, sensing the shift in Jonah's breathing. Jonah rubbed a hand over his face, fighting the anger boiling beneath his ribs. He forced himself to stay methodical. He began cataloging the trips, logging the times and dates, overlaying them onto the map. The routes formed clusters around certain areas of the forest. Remote, hard to reach, places where even hunters rarely ventured. He tapped the desk, deep in thought. Late-night drives, hidden rendezvous, a child left bruised and trembling in a cabin. This wasn't random cruelty. This was a pattern of control, of secrecy. He pulled out his notebook and scrawled a few words. Trafficking, hunting cover, storage. The questions sat like lead on the page. He didn't want to believe the answers his gut whispered, but he couldn't ignore them. Jonah leaned back, eyes closed. For a moment, the weight of his memories pressed down. The unsolved hit-and-run that had taken his wife. The cases of missing kids that had slipped through his fingers because no one could prove what they feared. He had carried that guilt for years. Now, staring at the glowing red dots on the map, he felt it all sharpen into a single point of resolve. This time, he wouldn't look away. He reached down, resting his hand on Ranger's head. The shepherd pressed closer, eyes steady, as if to remind him he wasn't alone in this hunt. Jonah opened his eyes, staring once more at the screen. "We're going to find out what he's hiding," he whispered. Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside the office window, the mist was beginning to lift. The town was stirring, unaware of the storm that had begun to gather in the quiet. The forest closed around them like a cathedral of shadows. Moonlight barely touched the ground, filtered through a canopy of black pine and ash. Jonah Keller guided his truck along a washed-out logging road until the tires could go no farther. He killed the engine, the silence pressing down heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal. Ranger leapt down first, his paws landing silently on wet earth. The shepherd's body was taut, ears pricked, nose working the night air. Jonah shouldered a flashlight but kept it angled low, the red beam casting a muted glow along the path. He'd traced this route from the surveillance logs, one of Martin Doyle's secret midnight runs. Jonah's gut told him there was something waiting here, something Doyle thought no one would ever find. The trail bent downward, the smell of damp moss and old wood thick in the air. Ranger pulled ahead, weaving between trees, pausing every few feet to sniff the ground. His tail was stiff, hackles twitching with every new scent. Jonah followed, careful with each step, his boots sinking into soft earth. They moved deeper, until the woods grew eerily still. No insects, no owls, only the sigh of wind through the branches, and beneath it, something else, a faint metallic clink. Jonah stopped. His breath caught. Ranger froze, ears swiveling, head tilted toward the sound. Jonah lifted the beam of his flashlight. There, beneath the slope of an old pine, the soil had been disturbed. The ground bulged unevenly, littered with scraps of wood and rusted nails. Jonah crouched low, sweeping away wet leaves with his gloved hand. His fingers struck wood. A chest. The surface was rough, splintered, half buried in the earth, as though someone had hurried to cover it. Jonah brushed aside more debris, revealing a rusted hinge, iron eaten by years of rain. He leaned back on his heels, heart pounding. "Jesus," he whispered. Ranger paced in a tight circle, nose close to the box, his body language stiff with unease. Then, as if compelled, he moved a few paces farther along the slope and stopped again. His paw scraped the ground, digging furiously. Jonah rushed over, helping pull back layers of mud and moss. Another chest emerged. Half buried, heavy, silent. Jonah's throat tightened. 2 boxes. How many more? He forced himself to stand, scanning the clearing. His flashlight caught more shapes, slight humps in the soil, aligned like unmarked graves. His stomach turned cold. Before he could think, the sound came again. Clink. It was faint, metallic, like chains rattling together. The noise floated on the wind, carried from somewhere deeper in the trees. Ranger's head snapped toward the sound, a low growl rolling from his chest. His eyes burned in the beam's edge, amber reflecting red. Then came something worse. A cry. Not loud, not clear. Just a thin, wavering sob. It threaded through the night like smoke, fragile enough to be mistaken for the wind. But Jonah knew better. He had heard too many cries in his life, from too many children whose voices went ignored. This one chilled him to the marrow. Ranger surged forward, pulling against the leash. Jonah caught him, gripping hard, his own body straining against the instinct to follow. "Wait!" he hissed, though his own voice shook. He swept the beam toward the sound, but the forest revealed nothing, only shifting shadows, branches creaking, fog curling low. The cry faded, swallowed by the night. Jonah's breath came hard, his pulse thundering in his ears. He looked down at the chests again, at the half-buried secrets Doyle had left here. His hands itched to pry them open, to see what horror lay inside. But he knew better. Not now. Not without backup. Not without airtight evidence. If he destroyed the chain of proof, Doyle could walk free. Still, the sound of that sob clung to him, haunting. He pulled his phone from his pocket and snapped photos. The disturbed ground, the exposed wood, the rusted hinges. He recorded a short clip, capturing Ranger's growl beneath the whisper of the wind. Every detail mattered. Then he crouched, pressing his hand briefly to the damp soil covering the second chest. "We'll come back," he murmured. "I swear it." Ranger pressed close, his breath hot, his muscles trembling with restrained urgency. Jonah met the shepherd's gaze. They both knew what they had heard. They both knew someone, or something, was still out there. Jonah pocketed his phone, tugging gently at the leash. "Come on, boy," Not tonight. Reluctantly, Ranger followed, though his head remained turned toward the dark woods, ears twitching at sounds Jonah couldn't hear. The forest seemed to close behind them as they climbed back toward the truck, each step heavy with the weight of discovery. When they reached the road, Jonah paused, staring back into the trees. The image of those chests, the metallic clinks, and that fragile cry carved itself into his mind. He knew sleep wouldn't come again tonight, maybe not for many nights to come. As they drove away, the headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the mist. Jonah's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. He whispered to himself, to Ranger, to the silent promise he'd made to Clara. We'll get to the bottom of this, whatever it takes. In the rearview mirror, the forest receded into darkness. But the cry lingered in his ears, a ghostly reminder that the woods still held secrets, and that Martin Doyle's sins reached deeper than anyone had dared to imagine. The night pressed heavy around the cabin like a shroud. The storm had passed, but the forest still dripped with its memory, branches sagging, leaves weeping into the mud. Jonah Keller crouched in the underbrush, breath clouding faintly in the cool air. In his pocket, the digital recorder blinked red, its tiny light pulsing like a heartbeat. Beside him, Ranger lay taut against the earth, every muscle humming with restrained violence. Hackles bristled, ears pivoted, amber eyes locked on the crooked silhouette of the house. From inside came the voice, harsh, slurred, Martin Doyle. "You think you're better than me?" Glass clattered. "Sitting there like you're some angel. You're nothing. You hear me? Nothing." Jonah angled the recorder toward the cabin. Every word, every slur, every venom-laced roar captured. His jaw clenched as he forced himself to stay still. Then it came, the sound that hollowed his chest, a child's cry. Clara, thin, broken, barely audible, but it cut like a knife. Ranger surged forward, a snarl rumbling low. Jonah gripped his collar, knuckles white. "Not yet," he whispered, though his own voice shook. "We need them to hear it." Inside, Doyle's fury rose. "Don't look at me like her. You think I don't know what you cost me?" A thud echoed. Jonah's stomach turned. Then came Clara's scream, high-pitched, raw, the kind that carved itself into bone. Jonah flinched, his entire body jerking with the instinct to storm the cabin. Ranger lunged, but Jonah held him back with both arms, heart hammering. The recorder's light blinked, still capturing. Every scream is another nail in Doyle's coffin. Jonah pressed his forehead to Ranger's neck, whispering, "Hold on, kid. Just a little longer." Minutes stretched like eternities. At last, Doyle's voice faltered, slurring into mutters before fading into drunken snores. Silence pressed thick against the walls. Jonah exhaled shakily. He clipped the recorder back inside his jacket, securing it like a sacred relic. His eyes lifted toward the grimy window. That was when he saw it. A hand, small, fragile, pressed flat against the glass. Jonah froze, binoculars half raised but useless now. The image was seared into him, dirt-smudged fingers trembling against the pane, a silent plea carved in the dark. Ranger moved first. The shepherd padded forward, silent as shadow. Jonah didn't stop him. Some things couldn't be commanded. Ranger reached the window. His nose brushed the glass, fogging a small circle. For a heartbeat, the world stilled. Child and dog. Separated by a pane of glass, yet bound by something deeper. Clara's hands spread wider, pressing into his warmth. Ranger leaned closer, amber eyes steady. a silent promise etched in the shape of a scarred shepherd. Jonah's vision blurred. He whispered hoarsely, "We're not leaving her." Clara's face appeared, faint in lantern glow, wide grey eyes ringed with shadows, locked on Ranger's. No fear, only raw recognition. "You hear me?" Ranger's tail shifted once, a slow, deliberate wag, a lifeline thrown across the chasm. Clara's lips moved, but Jonah couldn't hear the words. He didn't need to. For the first time, she wasn't alone. Jonah snapped a single photo, not for evidence but memory, proof that a bond had already formed in silence and shadow. Behind Clara, Martin shifted in his recliner. Jonah tensed, ready to drag Ranger back, but the man only rolled and muttered. Sleep reclaimed him. Jonah leaned close to Ranger, whispering, "She's ours now, boy. We don't leave her behind." Clara's fingers slid down the glass, leaving streaks in the condensation, before vanishing back into the dark. Ranger stayed pressed to the window until Jonah tugged him gently back. They retreated into the trees, but Jonah carried the image with him, the hand, the eyes, the moment when two survivors recognized each other as lifelines. Back at the edge of the ridge, Jonah pressed his forehead to Ranger's. The shepherd's breath warmed his skin, steady, grounding. "We'll come back," Jonah vowed, voice breaking. "We're not done." Ranger blinked, amber eyes unwavering. The vow was mirrored in silence. Then the night shifted. The cabin door scraped open, hinges groaned. A spill of yellow light cut across the porch. Martin Doyle stood silhouetted in the doorway, bottle dangling from his grip. Jonah sank low, pulling Ranger with him. The shepherd flattened into the grass, a shadow within shadow, eyes glowing faintly like banked embers. Martin staggered forward, muttering. Boards creaked under his boots. He spat into the dirt, sniffed the air. Jonah's lungs burned as he held his breath, and his fingers clamped tight on Ranger's collar. The shepherd quivered with restrained fury. Martin stepped into the yard, weaving unsteadily. Moonlight caught his face, slack, glassy, but not blind. There was a wariness beneath the haze, a hunter's instinct. He stopped, squinted into the trees, right where Jonah crouched. Seconds stretched into eternity. Jonah's pulse thundered. One wrong move, one growl, and everything would be lost. Martin tilted his head, sniffed, then barked a laugh. "Coyotes," he muttered, "always sneaking around." He swigged from the bottle, then dropped it into the grass with a curse. Jonah dared a shallow breath. For a moment Martin turned fully toward him, eyes narrowing. Ranger trembled, every muscle coiled. Jonah pressed a hand against his neck, whispering so faintly the words barely existed. "Not now. Please." The man bent, grabbed his bottle, and staggered back to the porch. The door yawned wide, spilling light, then slammed shut with a shudder. Silence returned. Jonah didn't move for a full minute, body rigid. Only when the cabin stayed quiet did he release a shaky breath. His hand ached from gripping Ranger so tightly. The shepherd licked his lips, then pressed against Jonah's side. Not a sound had escaped him. That was the only reason they were still free. Jonah scrubbed his face with both hands. One snap of a twig, one growl, and Clara would have been lost. He looked at the cabin, its faint glow behind filthy windows. He could almost hear her whisper again, "Please, someone, hear me." Jonah turned to Ranger. "He's starting to notice. Time's running out." Ranger's tail gave one slow thump in answer. Jonah touched the recorder inside his jacket, its weight pressing like judgment. Evidence. Enough to rattle Martin if he knew, not enough to break him yet. He rose, brushing damp earth from his knees, and gave Ranger a soft pat. Together, they melted back into the forest, swallowed by shadow. But Jonah carried the truth like fire in his chest. Their time for patience was nearly gone. The next step would not be observation. It would be a confrontation. And when that moment came, Jonah knew. Ranger wouldn't hesitate. Neither would he. The county office smelled faintly of paper, burnt coffee, and the disinfectant they used to keep the old carpets alive. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make Jonah Keller's head ache. Across from him sat Grace Ramirez, the child services worker he trusted more than anyone. On the table lay his evidence: the USB with Ed's gas station footage, the digital recorder of Martin Doyle's drunken tirades, and photos Jonah had taken from the ridge. The bruises on Clara's arms, shattered bottles, a cabin that looked more like a cage. Grace leaned forward, scrolling through files on his laptop. Each scream from the recorder made her flinch. She whispered, voice heavy with anger and fatigue, "Jonah, this is sickening. But in court, it's not airtight." Jonah's jaw tightened. A child's screams, bruises, and his own rants aren't enough. "You know how it works. Without medical reports, sworn testimony, direct evidence, the judge will call it circumstantial. If I move too soon, he'll bury us in appeals." Jonah slammed his palm softly against the table, startling Ranger at his boots. "She's in there tonight. Every minute we wait." Grace cut him off, firm but not unkind. "Every minute we rush could cost us. If he walks free on a technicality, she'll pay the price." The words hit like a stone. Jonah stared up at the buzzing light, choking down rage. He had lived his career by the book. But books didn't bleed. Clara did. Grace softened. "I'll file the emergency petition tonight, push for the morning docket. But enforcement could take days." "Days," Jonah repeated flatly. To Clara, days could be a death sentence. "Promise me," Grace said. "Don't take matters into your own hands. If you break in without a warrant, the court will give her right back to him." Jonah wanted to promise. But Clara's whisper, "Please, not tonight," echoed inside him. Finally he muttered, "I'll try." Grace studied him, knowing what he wasn't saying. "That's all I can ask." Ranger rose and pressed his muzzle to Jonah's knee, grounding him. The shepherd's amber eyes were steady, unyielding. Patience was not in their nature. "Go home," Grace urged. "I'll call when I hear from the judge." Jonah stood, tucking the recorder into his jacket like a relic. At the door, Grace warned, "If you go off book, I can't protect you." He paused. "If I don't, who's going to protect her?" Outside, the night smelled of rain and diesel. Jonah bent to Ranger. "We can't wait long, boy. Law or no law." Ranger's tail brushed his leg. Quiet agreement. They walked into the dark, the clock ticking against Clara's life. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, branches dripping, wind sighing low through black pines. The cabin crouched in its clearing, lamplight glowing faintly. Jonah and Ranger waited beyond the tree line, every sense straining. Inside, Martin Doyle's drunken roar split the night. "Useless little rat!" A chair crashed over. Clara whimpered. Jonah clenched his fists. He had sworn to wait, but the law felt like a paper shield. Ranger trembled at his side, hackles high, growl rumbling like distant thunder. Glass shattered. Clara's plea drifted out. "Please, stop, please." Jonah's stomach twisted. His mind flashed to the buried chests, to the cry they'd heard carried on the wind. How many others had begged those same words? Martin's shadow swayed against the cabin wall, a jagged stick clutched in his fist, his voice slurred with venom. "You look at me like her, just like her." Clara backed into the wall, hands raised, tears streaking her face. Martin raised the stick high. Ranger erupted. The shepherd's roar shook the clearing. His body quivered, claws digging into soil, muscles coiled to spring. Jonah strained against the leash, whispering, "Easy, boy," though his own hands shook. Then Clara screamed, not a whimper, an unrestrained, piercing cry. Something inside Jonah broke. Law, promises, patience, snapped like dry twigs. He surged forward, yanking Ranger with him. "Enough!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the woods. Martin froze mid-swing, eyes darting to the window. Jonah no longer cared about cover, career, or consequence. Only Clara's scream, and the shepherd beside him, fury barely leashed. Time held its breath. Then Ranger moved. With a roar, he hurled himself forward. Glass shattered in a spray of shards as his body crashed through the window. Clara shielded her face, wide eyes locked on the blur of muscle and fury. Martin turned too slow. Ranger hit him like a freight train, driving him back against the wall. The stick flew from his hand, teeth sank deep into his arm, blood spread across torn flannel. Martin shrieked as Ranger bore him down. Jonah kicked the door in, gun raised. "Police, don't move!" Martin writhed, reaching for the fallen stick, but Jonah stomped it down and kept his aim steady. "Drop it! Now!" The man froze, chest heaving, whiskey reeking from his breath. Jonah holstered his weapon, lunged, and cuffed him, Ranger releasing on command. Blood streaked the dog's muzzle, but his amber eyes never left Martin. With Martin broken and bound, Jonah turned. Clara huddled in the corner, shaking violently, hoodie soaked with tears. She hadn't moved through the chaos, clutching her knees as if the world might collapse. Jonah's voice softened. "Clara, it's over." But her eyes weren't on him. They were fixed on Ranger. The shepherd stepped closer, breathing rough, lowering his scarred muzzle to nudge her gently. The dam broke. Clara clutched his neck, sobbing raggedly into his fur. Not silent tears, but the flood of years' worth of fear finally breaking loose. Ranger leaned into her grasp, still and steady. Jonah's throat burned. He had seen children cry before, but never like this. Never a cry that carried years of silence finally shattering. Outside, sirens wailed, red and blue lights flickering faintly through the trees. Help was coming, but always late. Jonah knelt by Clara, laying a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe now. You'll never be alone again. I promise." She didn't answer, clinging tighter to Ranger, as though he were the only bridge between her shattered world and what came next. Jonah stood, chest heaving, and let the weight of it settle. Martin cuffed and bleeding on the floor, Clara sobbing into the shepherd's neck, sirens and headlights pressing at the door. For the first time in years, the cabin was no longer just a prison. Tonight, it became the place where everything changed. The Evergrove Hospital wasn't large, just 2 stories of brick and narrow hallways that smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. But to Clara, it might as well have been another world. After nights of fear, the humming lights felt too bright, the air too safe to trust. Jonah walked beside the gurney as nurses wheeled her in, Ranger trotting close, paws clicking against linoleum. His fur was still dusted with glass, but his amber eyes stayed locked on Clara. Each time a nurse leaned near, her hand tightened in his mane, desperate. "It's okay," murmured Trevor Sims, The ER nurse, his tone steady from years of trauma care. He can stay. We won't separate you. That was all she needed. Clara didn't nod or speak, but her fists loosened enough for the stethoscope to touch her chest. Her gaze never left Ranger's profile, as though his breathing was the only anchor she trusted. Jonah stood in the corner, arms crossed, chest aching. He had seen battlefield wounds and car wrecks, but nothing tore at him like watching a child endure routine exams with the resignation of a prisoner. The bruises on her ribs, the half-healed cuts, the tremor in her hands whenever latex brushed her skin. Sensing her tension, Ranger pressed his weight against the gurney, a living shield. Clara buried her face in his fur whenever instruments came close. The nurses worked quietly, grateful for the dog who did what medicine couldn't. Hours blurred, blood pressure, vitals, whispered notes on clipboards. Clara stayed silent, but her hand never let go. At one point, Jonah crouched by her side. "Clara, look at me." Slowly, her gray eyes lifted, red-rimmed and glassy, yet carrying the faintest glimmer of hope. "You're safe now," Jonah whispered. "You'll never be alone again." "Not while I'm here. Not while Ranger's here." Her lip trembled. She didn't speak. Instead, she pressed her forehead to Ranger's scarred muzzle. The shepherd exhaled a long breath, tail brushing once against the bed frame. The promise hung in the air like a vow sealed by 3 hearts. Later, when a nurse offered to move her upstairs, Clara looked only at Ranger. When he padded forward, she followed, one fist still in his fur. The room was small but clean, white sheets, faded balloon mural on the wall. Clara climbed onto the bed silently, curling with Ranger stretched beside her. Her hand rested on his flank, as if afraid he'd vanish in the night. Jonah sank into the chair by the window. Outside, the storm had passed, neon lights reflecting in puddles. Exhaustion pressed heavy on him, but the sight of the girl curled around the shepherd hardened his resolve. The world had broken her. Tonight, in this quiet room, something had shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. "You're home now, Clara," he murmured. "We'll carry this together." Ranger's ears flicked. Clara's hand tightened faintly in his fur. It was enough. That night, for the first time in years, Clara Doyle slept without fear. Days blurred into a rhythm of medical rounds and whispered hallway conversations. Clara spoke little. Her silence was armor. But her eyes were changing. They softened when Jonah entered, lit faintly whenever Ranger nudged her arm. She didn't laugh yet, but the hollow gaze from the cabin had begun to crack. One afternoon, sunlight spilled pale gold through the window, warming the sheets. Grace Ramirez entered, carrying a small box. "Thought she might like this," she said, setting it down. Inside were crayons, worn and frayed, and a sketch pad with clean pages. Nothing extraordinary, but to Clara, it was a treasure. She reached hesitantly, as if expecting someone to take it away. When no one did, she drew the box close, tracing the edges with her fingers. "It's yours," Jonah said gently. "You can draw anything you want." She didn't answer. She opened the pad, selected a midnight blue crayon, and stared at the blank page. Her hand trembled, as though the beginning itself was too heavy. Then the first line appeared, shaky, uneven, but growing. Jonah leaned forward, recognizing the shape. The curve of a back, the slope of ears, the stance of strength. Ranger. The shepherd lifted his head, sensing himself on the page. Clara glanced at him, then pressed harder, adding stars above, crooked dots of yellow and silver, the kind of stars she must have wished on through long nights of silence. At the bottom, she scrawled 2 words, "My hero." Uneven letters, but to Jonah, They were stronger than any testimony. It was the voice of a survivor, speaking not with sound, but with light. He swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head on Clara's lap. A faint smile flickered across her face, the first Jonah had seen. Grace covered her mouth, whispering, "She's telling you everything she can't say." Jonah nodded, too choked for words. Heroes didn't always wear badges or carry guns. Sometimes they had scars and paws, and they listened when the world stayed deaf. Clara hugged the sketchpad to her chest, eyes closing. She could finally rest, knowing her hero was real, and still there. The courthouse in Evergrove was old brick, its halls heavy with wood polish and paper. Clouds clung low to the mountains that morning, gray fingers of doubt brushing the town. Jonah stood at the steps with Ranger and Clara just behind him. She wore clean jeans and a borrowed sweater, hair brushed into order. But her hand never left Ranger's fur. Each step was cautious, tethered to him as though the world might still steal her back. Inside, the courtroom felt too large for the handful gathered. Judge Ellen Morell presided, silver-haired, firm, yet known for empathy. Grace Ramirez rose, her file thick with photos, reports, recordings. "Your Honor, we request emergency guardianship for Clara Doyle. She was removed from Martin Doyle after confirmed abuse. Evidence includes medical reports, sworn officer testimony, and recordings. Officer Jonah Keller, present, responded to the scene with his retired canine partner. Clara's immediate and unbreakable bond with the animal makes this placement vital." The judge peered over her glasses. "Why Officer Keller specifically?" Grace's reply was simple, certain. "Because Clara refuses to be separated from the dog, and Ranger belongs to him." All eyes turned to the girl. Clara sat small and silent, knees drawn close, hand buried in Ranger's collar. "Clara," the judge said gently, "can you hear me?" Her gray eyes flicked up, then down again. She said nothing. Instead, she pressed her forehead into Ranger's neck. The shepherd stood steady, carrying her silence. Judge Morell sighed softly. "Children don't always use words to tell us what they need, but I can see what she's telling me." She folded her hands. "Under supervised guardianship, Clara Doyle will remain in Officer Jonah Keller's custody, pending review in 60 days. Oversight will ensure her best interests." The gavel fell once, echoing like a bell. Clara's grip tightened on Ranger, not from fear, but relief. For the first time, she wasn't being passed along like a burden. She was anchored to the dog who had heard her cry, and to the man who had promised she'd never be alone again. Jonah exhaled, weight settling on him, not a burden, but a mantle. Fatherhood, fragile and untested, but real. When they stepped into the daylight, the clouds had thinned, streaks of sun breaking across the courthouse stone. Clara squinted into the brightness, leaning into Ranger. Jonah slowed his steps, aware the road ahead was no longer his alone. He looked down at the girl, at the shepherd, at the bond written in their silence. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them as a family. The mountains always seemed quieter after a storm. Branches dripped steadily, the ground soft with mud and pine needles. Jonah Keller moved carefully, flashlight beams sweeping the shadows. Ranger padded at his side, tail stiff, ears pricked, every muscle alert. Jonah had promised Grace he'd leave things to the courts, that Clara was safe now. But the memory of those half-buried chests gnawed at him. A man who beat a child might bury far darker sins. They reached the ridge where pines grew thick and black with dampness. Jonah crouched low, pushing aside brush. There it was, the first chest, its edges jutting from the soil, wood warped, and lock rusted. 2 more lay nearby, hidden beneath moss. Jonah's stomach tightened. "Show me," he murmured. Ranger sniffed, pawing at the ground with urgency. Jonah dug with bare hands until the lid came free. The smell hit first. Mildew, decay, something older. He forced it open. Inside lay hunting trophies, antlers, pelts, feathers, but beneath them, a child's hair ribbon, a scuffed shoe, a doll's cracked porcelain face. The second chest was the same, animal trophies layered over children's belongings, a baseball cap, a cloth bracelet, a torn photograph of a smiling child. Jonah's throat burned as he slammed the lid shut. The third chest was smaller, heavier. Chains, handcuffs, a frayed jump rope striped red and blue. Jonah dropped it like it burned. For a long moment, he knelt in the mud, rain dripping off his hood, trembling. This wasn't cruelty. It was a ritual. Ranger whined softly, pressing against his shoulder. Jonah forced himself to snap photos. Each chest, each object, proof, not suspicion, evidence. But the scope of it chilled him. How many names had been buried in these woods, written not on paper, but in toys left to rot under soil? He covered the chests again, jaw set. He couldn't move them alone tonight, but he wouldn't let them stay forgotten. Rising, he looked into Ranger's amber eyes glowing in the beam of his flashlight. "We were right, boy," he whispered, voice raw with grief. "He's been hunting children for years." The wind sighed through the pines, low and mournful. Jonah pocketed his phone. This was no longer about one girl, one night. It was about every cry that had gone unheard. And Jonah knew. He and Ranger stood on the edge of something darker than he had ever feared. Later, Jonah's desk lamp cast pale light across scattered papers, a half-empty mug, and the photos he had taken. Evergrove lay silent in the mist outside, but his small office was alive with tension. Ranger lay on the rug, head on his paws, ears twitching at every rustle of paper. Jonah forced himself to stare at the evidence again. The ribbon, the doll's face, the rusted chains. He pulled up the sheriff's database, scanning missing child reports. Amy Lawson, age 9, vanished in 2015 walking home from school. Jonah traced Martin's trips on a map. One route passed directly by the trail where the chests were buried. Michael Ruiz, age 11, missing near Miller Creek in 2017. The same stretch of forest where Martin's cabin stood. One by one, the threads aligned. Martin Doyle hadn't just been a violent drunk. He had been a predator, using hunting trips as cover. Jonah's pen scratched furiously, lines connecting midnight drives to unsolved cases. The patterns were too precise to ignore. His phone buzzed. Grace Ramirez. "You couldn't leave it alone," she said. Jonah hesitated. "I went back, found the chests." Grace fell silent. Then, "Tell me." He described everything, the trophies, the children's belongings, the chains. When he finished, Grace exhaled hard. "God, Jonah, this means Clara wasn't the first, and if we're not careful, she won't be the last." Her voice dropped lower. "And people in this town may have known. Reports don't just vanish. Someone let Martin roam those woods unchecked." Jonah thought of the sheriff's office, the way complaints about strange noises had been brushed aside, the nods Martin used to get at diners. Respect turned to silence. Silence turned to cover. "You think they protected him?" Jonah asked. Grace's reply was weary but sharp. "I think people would rather ignore a monster than admit they missed the signs. But if you pull this thread, Jonah, it won't stop at Martin." Jonah's gaze shifted to Clara's drawing taped on his desk, Ranger beneath a sky of stars. "My hero" scrawled at the bottom. That image steadied him more than law ever could. "I don't care who it touches," he said quietly. "If there are more children buried out there, we'll find them. And if anyone tried to bury the truth, they're going down too." On the rug, Ranger lifted his head, tail thumping once in quiet assent. Grace's voice softened but carried steel. "Then we do this right. Quiet. Careful. No leaks. Just you, me, and the dog. For now." Jonah allowed himself a grim smile. "That's a good team." The call ended. Jonah leaned back, staring at the mist outside his window. The scope of Martin's darkness had widened, but so had his resolve. He reached down, resting a hand on Ranger's head. "We'll finish this. For her. For all of them." Ranger's tail brushed the rug like a gavel in the night. Hours passed. The lamplight spilled over maps and notes, but the room itself felt darker. Jonah traced Martin's roots again. The more he compared them with hunting permits, the more the truth emerged. The permits weren't about deer or boar. They mapped vast stretches of Appalachian backcountry, remote areas where screams could vanish without echo. Hunting had been Martin's camouflage. The animal trophies were a cover. The chains and jump rope weren't tools of sport. They were tools of captivity. Jonah's chest tightened. Martin hadn't acted alone. He thought of the missing reports that never gained traction. Neighbors dismissing strange noises as wind. Deputies shrugging off complaints. One man couldn't keep all this hidden. Someone had helped, or chosen not to see. His phone buzzed again. Grace. He explained what he'd pieced together. The permits, the overlap with missing children, the handcuffs. "That's not just abuse," Grace said grimly. "That's organized. Jonah, if you're right, Martin was supplying kids." The word struck like a hammer. Supplying. Jonah gripped the desk edge, knuckles white. "Trafficking," he whispered. Grace didn't soften it. "Clara's case could unravel this entire town. If Martin was part of a pipeline, we're talking years of cover-ups, maybe law enforcement, maybe higher." People don't ignore vanishing kids without a reason. Jonah thought of the sheriff, of deputies who waved off reports, of files that conveniently went missing. His gut twisted. "You think they were in on it?" "I think," Grace said carefully, "that protecting reputations has always come easier than protecting children. And Martin exploited that." Jonah looked at Ranger, steady amber eyes watching him from the rug. Clara's face flashed in his mind, pressed to the cabin window, whispering, "Please." That wasn't chance. That was destiny. "I can't let this stay buried," Jonah said, voice iron. "Clara deserves more than rescue. She deserves the truth." Grace's voice carried both caution and resolve. "Then we move carefully. Build the case piece by piece. No leaks. Clara's story could bring the whole house down, but we only get one shot." Jonah leaned back, exhaustion pressing heavily, but resolved harder. Clara's drawing still hung on the wall, a child's voice etched in shaky letters. "My hero." "This isn't about me," he said softly. "It's about her, and all the ones who never got heard." Ranger rose, pressing his head against Jonah's knee. Jonah rested his hand on the shepherd's neck. "Then we make it count," he whispered. Outside, the mist thickened, wrapping Evergrove in secrecy. But Jonah no longer saw fog. He saw shadows, and he was ready to drag them into the light. Clara's case had started with a whisper in the storm. Now it threatened to shatter years of silence, and Jonah knew they had only just begun. The lake lay still that morning, a mirror of gray sky turning pale gold as the sun rose. Jonah Keller stood on the porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching Ranger nose the damp grass along the shoreline. For the first time in weeks, peace brushed faintly at the edges of his chest. Behind him came the soft shuffle of bare feet. Clara hovered in the doorway, wrapped in an oversized sweatshirt. Her eyes held less of the emptiness that had shadowed her since the storm. Jonah smiled gently. "Morning, kiddo. Sleep all right?" She gave the smallest nod, then drifted toward Ranger. The shepherd leaned against her side, tail sweeping once, twice, assuring her this place was hers too. Jonah watched her shoulders ease as her hand sank into his fur. Inside, the cabin had begun to change. Jonah had cleared out the old guest room, painted the walls cream, and set a small desk by the window. Shelves now held fairy tales and adventure stories. On the desk sat a box of markers, paints, and pencils. Grace's idea: give her tools. When she can't use words, let her draw. "Got something to show you," Jonah said softly. Clara followed him in, Ranger close at her heels. When she stepped into the room, her eyes widened. She froze, afraid to touch anything. Jonah kept his voice low. "It's yours, all of it." "Thought maybe you could make this space your own." She moved slowly to the desk, fingers grazing the wood. She lifted a pencil as though it might break. Ranger settled at her feet. Jonah lingered in the doorway, giving her space. For a long while, only the scratch of graphite filled the house. When Jonah peeked back in, Clara was bent over the page. He leaned against the frame, his chest tightening. She had drawn 3 figures: a tall man with broad shoulders, a small girl with long hair, and beside them, a German shepherd with proud ears. Above their heads, uneven letters spelled, "My team." Jonah crouched beside her. "That's us?" She nodded, shading Ranger's coat carefully. He let out a slow breath. "Looks like a pretty strong team to me." Clara glanced at him then, really looked, her eyes searching his face. Jonah met her gaze, steady, letting her see what he had promised in the hospital. She would never be alone again. Her tension eased. She slipped her hand deeper into Ranger's fur. As sunlight streamed through the window, Clara added stars above their heads. She didn't speak, but Jonah understood. Even in the darkest nights, their team would walk beneath a sky that promised something better. That evening, quiet wrapped the lake house. Cicadas hummed, the water rippled silver, and inside, the fire burned low. Jonah sat in his chair with a closed novel on his lap. Ranger sprawled on the rug. Clara sat cross-legged nearby, sketchbook open, pencils smudging her fingers. It had become their ritual. Jonah reading, Clara drawing, Ranger keeping watch. For the first time, normalcy brushed against them. Fragile, tentative, but real. Jonah studied her in the firelight. Her face, once frozen, now carried a soft focus. Sometimes, she even hummed while she drew, each note like sunlight breaking through clouds. Tonight, she was quiet, her pencil moving slowly. "What's this one about?" Jonah asked gently. "A house," she whispered. Jonah smiled. "Looks like you're already sitting in one." Her lips quirked faintly, but she kept shading. Ranger shifted closer, pressing against her side. She leaned into him without hesitation. Minutes passed. Then Clara's pencil stilled. She stared at the page, fingers curling as though bracing herself. The air seemed to shift. And then, softly, so softly Jonah almost missed it, she whispered, "Can I call you Dad?" The pencil slipped from her hand. Her shoulders hunched, braced for rejection. The words hung between them, fragile as glass. Jonah's chest tightened. He set the book aside and knelt on the rug beside her. Ranger stayed close, resting his chin on Clara's lap, amber eyes steady. You never had to ask, Jonah said, voice thick. Her head snapped up, eyes wide. He cupped her cheek gently, tears burning his own. From the moment Ranger found you, you've been ours. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stays. And I'm not going anywhere. One tear slipped down her cheek. Then she leaned forward, wrapping her arms around his neck. Jonah held her carefully, as though she were both fragile and unbreakable. Ranger whined softly, pressing closer, his weight steady against them. Clara buried her face in Jonah's shoulder, one hand clutching Ranger's fur. Jonah closed his eyes, forehead resting against her hair, heart aching with the enormity of it. The trust she had given, the bond they had built from whispers and drawings. After a long while, she pulled back, her voice hoarse but steady. Dad. One word. Small. Simple. It landed in Jonah's chest like a vow. He nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight. Ranger sighed, as though sealing the moment. Jonah looked between the child and the dog, the two souls who had pulled him from grief, who asked for nothing but loyalty, who gave him everything in return. He whispered, "We're a team. Always." Clara smiled faintly through her tears. For the first time, hope shone in her eyes. The town hall in Evergrove had hosted decades of debates and parades. But tonight, the folding chairs filled with something heavier, whispers of change. Neighbors settled with cautious glances. Some Jonah knew well, others only by sight. At the front, Grace Ramirez shuffled her notes. Jonah stood beside her, Ranger at his heel. Clara sat in the front row, sketchbook balanced on her knees. She wasn't here to speak, but her presence was the quiet center of the room. "Thank you for coming," Grace began. Her voice carried steady fire. "This isn't about politics. It's about children, those who fall through the cracks, those who survive what no child should." Jonah stepped forward. He wasn't a man of speeches, but Clara's steady gaze anchored him. "Most of you know what happened," he said. "You've heard about the cabin, about Martin Doyle, about the little girl who lived through it. But what you don't know is she survived because someone listened, because a voice in the storm answered." Ranger stirred at his side. Jonah's hand brushed his fur. "We can't change the past, but we can build something for the future. A place where children who've been hurt can heal, where they can be seen." Grace explained logistics, donations, volunteers, grants. Doubt softened into fragile possibility. All the while, Clara sketched quietly. She drew the outline of a building with wide windows spilling light, trees standing tall. At its center she placed Ranger, ears alert, tail curled as if guarding the whole place. When Grace asked for name ideas, voices rose. Evergrove Child Center, Safe Start House, the Haven Project. But Clara lifted her head. Her voice trembled but carried clear. "Ranger's Haven." The room stilled. Clara flushed, clutching her pencil, but Jonah crouched beside her, nodding gently. "Go on, sweetheart. Tell them why." She pressed a hand into Ranger's fur. "Because he listens. When no one else did. He heard me. He always hears." Silence fell, not awkward but reverent. Truth carried by a child who had survived storms most couldn't imagine. An older woman wiped her eyes. A man at the back nodded firmly. One by one, others followed. Grace's voice softened. "Ranger's Haven, then. A place built on listening. On loyalty. On the promise that no child's cry will go unheard again." Jonah's chest tightened. He glanced at Clara, who ducked back into her sketchbook, a faint smile curling her lips. Ranger thumped his tail against the floor, sealing the choice. By night's end, volunteers had signed up. Donations were pledged. Plans were sketched, not neat but hopeful. As they stepped into the cool night, stars shimmered above Evergrove. Clara clutched her drawing of the new building, her team standing in front, Ranger larger than life. Jonah looked down at her. "Looks like you named it, kiddo." Clara's voice was faint but sure. "Because he listens." Jonah laid a hand on her shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. The town would build the walls, but the soul of it was already alive, in the bond between a girl and her dog. As they walked home beneath the stars, Jonah knew. Shadows still lingered in Evergrove. But now, light had a name. The morning sun broke gently over Evergrove, casting gold across the lake and painting the trees in soft light. Families followed the path toward a new building where weeds once grew wild. A sign above the entrance read, "Ranger's Haven, a safe start for children." Balloons bobbed in the breeze, colors bright against pale wood siding. Rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, officers, teachers, and children clutching parents' hands. Pride mingled with relief that something beautiful had risen where silence once lived. Jonah stood to the side of the stage, uniform pressed but not stiff, his hands clasped. He scanned the crowd, faces he knew, faces weighed with guilt and gratitude. But his gaze kept drifting to the child who had brought them all here. At his heel, Ranger sat tall, coat gleaming, amber eyes steady. Children leaned forward, whispering excitedly, pointing as though in the presence of a legend. Then Clara stepped onto the stage. She wore a soft yellow dress, ribbon tied at her waist, dark hair stirring in the breeze, still thin, still carrying shadows, but her steps were steady now. In her hands, oversized scissors gleamed. The crowd hushed. Grace Ramirez stepped forward to the podium, her voice warm, clear. A year ago, this was only a dream. Today, we dedicate it to the children who need safety and hope. And it is only right that the first ribbon be cut by the child who gave this haven its name. Applause swelled. Clara froze, glancing at Jonah. He gave a small nod. Ranger brushed his nose against her hand, grounding her. She turned to the ribbon, her fingers tightened on the scissors. "For the ones who weren't heard," she whispered. The blades snipped. The ribbon fell. At that exact moment, Ranger barked, deep, powerful, echoing across the lawn. The sound rolled like a benediction. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, tears. Clara smiled, radiant for the first time in front of so many people, her hand instinctively finding Ranger's fur. Jonah blinked hard against the sting in his eyes. Grace gestured for Clara to speak, but instead she lifted her sketchbook, holding it high. On the page was her drawing of the building, Ranger at its center, stars above. 3 figures, Jonah, Clara, and Ranger, stood together beneath the roof. The crowd fell silent. They didn't need speeches. The drawing was enough. Jonah looked at Ranger, whose tail brushed the stage floor once, twice. The shepherd sat like a sentinel, as if he knew. A year ago he had heard a whisper in the storm. Today the whole town was listening. The ceremony rolled on with music and laughter. But Jonah knew the defining moment had already passed. Clara had stepped into the sunlight unafraid, cutting not just a ribbon, but the chains of her past. When the crowd dispersed, Jonah whispered to her and Ranger, "This is just the beginning." Clara squeezed his hand. Ranger looked out toward the lake, ears pricked, as if already listening for the next cry on the wind. Autumn sunlight slanted through Clara's classroom. Mrs. Grafton smiled at her students. Today's assignment: write an essay titled My Hero. It doesn't need to be long. Just tell me who your hero is and why. Pencils scratched. Some children wrote about firefighters, others about moms or soldiers. At the back, Clara bent over her paper. Writing had become her way back into voice. She pressed her pencil to the page. My hero has paws, a scar, and ears that hear even the cries no one else does. He doesn't need words to understand me. He saved me from the dark and gave me a family. My hero is Ranger. Her chest felt lighter. She folded the essay carefully, guarding its weight. That evening, Jonah sat at the kitchen table, the house scented with tomato soup and wood smoke. Ranger snored by the fire. Clara slid her folded paper across the table, shy but insistent. Homework, she whispered. You can read it. Jonah unfolded the page. His eyes traced each line. Then again. By the end, his vision blurred. He set the paper down, his hand resting over her words, as if to keep them from vanishing. He looked at Clara, who watched nervously. You mean this? She nodded. Every word. Jonah's voice thickened. He glanced at Ranger, who had lifted his head, ears pricked. Jonah chuckled weakly. That dog's going to get a swelled head if he ever learns to read. Clara smiled, but her next question was soft, fragile. Do you think Ranger knows he's a hero? Jonah looked at the shepherd, the scar along his flank, the steady amber eyes, the tail that thumped whenever Clara drew near. He swallowed. I think he knows he's loved. And sometimes, Clara, that's the same thing. Her lashes shimmered with tears. She slid from her chair, knelt beside Ranger, and buried her face in his fur. The shepherd sighed, pressing closer, tail sweeping the floor. Jonah watched, pride and awe swelling inside him. A year ago, her voice had been a whisper. Now it was strong enough to name a hero. He folded the essay carefully, tucking it into his desk. Evidence, not of a crime, but of healing. That night, the lake lay silver under starlight. Clara stood barefoot on the porch, Ranger at her side, his coat glowing faintly in the moonlight. She leaned against him, small and steady. She tilted her face to the sky and whispered, Thank you for finding me. Her forehead pressed to Ranger's, her voice trembling. Sometimes I still hear him in dreams. But when I wake and you're here, I know I'm safe. You're my forever hero. Ranger's chest rumbled softly. Not bark, not growl, but acknowledgement. His tail brushed against her leg. Jonah watched unseen from the window, heart aching at the sight. Clara pointed at a star, bright against the velvet sky. That one's Mom's. She can see us now. She knows I'm not alone. Jonah stepped onto the porch, his voice low. She'd be proud, Clara. She turned, then relaxed. He drew her close, his arm circling her shoulders, hand resting on Ranger's back. Together, the three of them stood beneath the constellations. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or light, Jonah said softly. Sometimes they come quiet, on four paws, with ears sharp enough to hear a whisper. Clara smiled faintly. Then Ranger's our miracle. Jonah nodded, throat thick. Our miracle, and our reminder that even when the world tries to silence us, someone is always listening. Ranger thumped his tail hard against the porch, sealing the truth. Clara pressed her lips to his ear. I love you. The shepherd leaned closer, silent but sure. His tail swept the boards with the rhythm of a heartbeat. I'm still listening. The story that began with a whisper in the storm closed not on fear, but on faith. Faith in second chances. Faith in quiet miracles. Faith in the bond between a man, a child, and a shepherd who turned a whisper into a promise that would last a lifetime. Sometimes the most powerful stories aren't about grand gestures, but about quiet moments. A child leaning into a dog's fur, a loyal shepherd standing guard when no one else would. German shepherds remind us of something we all long for: steadfast love, protection, and a bond that doesn't need words to be real. Their loyalty teaches us that healing often begins with simply being seen and being heard. If you've ever looked into your own dog's eyes and felt that unspoken connection, you already know what I mean. And if you'd like to deepen that bond, to understand your dog a little better, to share in the quiet language they've been speaking to you all along, there's a resource I've found helpful. I'll leave it here in case you'd like to take a look. No pressure, no pitch. Just something you might enjoy exploring, the way you'd follow a gentle trail on a Sunday walk. Because in the end, every story like this one reminds us, the love we give our animals always comes back to us, often in ways we never expect. Take care, friend, and give your dog an extra hug tonight.